The Savannah Yacht Club smelled like salt air and quiet money. My sister Victoria sat at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, her face glowing under the amber chandeliers. She was celebrating what she called her influencer gala, a night she insisted would finally put her on the map. My mother, Melissa, stood up, tapping her crystal flute with a silver fork. To Victoria, she said, her voice thick with performative pride, to the only child who isn't afraid to chase the big dreams. Everyone clapped. I clapped too, my hands moving mechanically. Then the waiter arrived. He didn't go to my mother, he didn't go to my father. He walked straight to me and placed a heavy leather folder next to my water glass. I opened it. $7,500. It wasn't just a bill. It was an assumption. Melissa leaned over, her breath smelling of expensive Merlot. Architect salaries are stable, sweetie, she whispered, her hand patting my arm. Support your sister, it's the least you can do. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The silence that followed wasn't the polite hush of people waiting for a thank you speech. It was a suffocating vacuum. It was the kind of heavy, pressurized air that follows a gunshot in a crowded room. I didn't look at my father, Brian, who was busy trying to catch the eye of a local developer at the next table. I didn't look at my sister Victoria, whose smirk was still plastered on her face, bright and sharp as a razor. I looked only at the leather folder. $7,500. It was more than a bill. It was a physical manifestation of my role in this family. My mother's hand was still on my arm, her manicured nails digging slightly into my skin, an anchor of expectation. To them, my architectural career wasn't a profession I had bled for. It was a reliable tap, a stable supply chain they could hook into whenever Victoria's influencer dreams needed a new infusion of capital. Architect salaries are stable, she had said. The words echoed in my head, cold and clinical. They didn't see the 18-hour days or the years of grinding for a license. They only saw the balance. I thought about the $5,000 I had written for my father's DUI bail. I thought about the $4,000 security deposit for Victoria's first apartment that I never saw again. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdraft for years. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Sadness requires an investment I no longer had the currency for. Instead, I felt a strange, icy precision settle behind my eyes. I reached out, my fingers cool against the grain of the leather. I closed the folder slowly, savoring the soft, muffled thud of the paper. Then, I placed 2 fingers on the edge and slid it. I watched it glide across the polished mahogany table, cutting through the silence until the corner hit the stem of Melissa's wine glass with a sharp, crystalline clink. I think the brand should pay for its own launch, I said. My voice didn't shake. It was calm, steady, and loud enough to reach the minor guests and local bloggers sitting 3 tables away. The air in the room shifted instantly. The pressure dropped. I saw the color drain from my mother's face, leaving her looking older, frilier, and suddenly very human under the amber lights. Victoria's mouth hung open, her queen on a throne posture collapsing. I stood up, my legs felt strangely light, as if they weren't quite attached to the floor of the Savannah Yacht Club anymore. I was shedding weight I had carried for 27 years. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't wait for the hiss or the inevitable scene. I turned and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I heard the frantic scrape of a chair and my mother's voice, no longer a soothing whisper but a jagged, desperate command. Olivia, sit down. You are embarrassing this family. I didn't stop. I walked past the host stand, past the rows of quiet money and traditional Savannah prestige, and out through the heavy oak doors. The wind hit my face, sharp and biting, smelling of salt and the marshes of Georgia. For the first time all evening, I took a full, deep breath. The cold air felt honest. It didn't have the cloying scent of truffle oil or the metallic tang of performative pride. Ryan was right behind me. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't tell me I should go back and apologize to keep the peace. He just walked to the car, his jaw set in a hard line, and opened the door for me. He knew. He had seen the silent investor in me die at that table. As we got in, I looked back at the yacht club. The warm glow from the windows made the building look like a sanctuary, but I knew better. It was a prison without bars, a house of glass where the only way to belong was to be useful. I watched the golden light reflect off the water as Ryan started the engine. The drive home was silent, but it wasn't the heavy silence of the restaurant. It was a blank page. I stared out the window at the passing streetlights of Savannah, waiting for the wave of guilt to hit. I waited for the familiar panic, the urge to turn the car around, the desperate need to fix the mess I had just made, but it never came. Instead, there was only a strange, cold clarity. I looked at my hands resting in my lap. They weren't trembling. For years, I had smoothed things over and absorbed the shocks. Tonight, I had handed the bill back, and the world hadn't fallen. I was just a woman in a car, driving home with my wallet still closed. "You okay?" Ryan asked quietly, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "I don't know," I said. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. "I think I just resigned from the family business." "Good," he said, his eyes on the road. "It was about time they realized you aren't an open credit line." We pulled into our driveway, and I looked up at our apartment. It looked peaceful, safe. I knew my phone was probably already vibrating with notifications, a digital storm gathering its force. But out here, in the quiet of the night, I felt like I was finally driving my own life. I unlocked the door and stepped into the dark living room. I didn't turn on the lights. I stood in the hallway, shedding my silk dress like a suit of armor I no longer needed. For years, I had convinced myself that I was the strong one because I was the fixer. I was the responsible daughter who held the family together while everyone else fell apart. But standing there in the silence, I realized that was a lie I had told myself to survive. I wasn't a martyr, I was a gambler. There is a concept in psychology called the gambler's fallacy. It is the mistaken belief that if you just put enough kindness, enough money, and enough effort into the machine, eventually it has to pay out. I had treated my family like a rigged slot machine for a decade. I kept feeding it coins, convinced that the jackpot of love and validation was mathematically inevitable. I thought about the coins I had dropped into that slot, the $5,000 for my father's DUI bail, the $4,000 apartment deposit for Victoria, the countless loans for emergencies that were really only consequences of their own poor planning. Every time I paid, I told myself this was the last one. This was the investment that would finally yield a return of respect. Sometimes the machine would flash a few lights, a thank you text, a hug at Christmas, a moment where my mother would say she didn't know what they would do without me. Those small payouts were just enough to keep me pulling the lever. But tonight, looking at that bill in the yacht club, I realized the game was fixed. The machine wasn't broken. It was designed to take. It was never going to pay out the jackpot I was waiting for. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of water. My hands were steady. I wasn't waiting for a win anymore. I had simply run out of coins. I walked into the bedroom, the silence of the apartment feeling heavy and charged. Ryan was in the kitchen, giving me the space he knew I needed. My phone was on the nightstand, face down, but even from across the room, I could hear it vibrating against the wood. It wasn't a gentle buzz, it was a frantic, angry rattle. I stared at it for a moment, the screen lighting up the dark room with spasmodic flashes. I picked it up. The notifications were stacked like bricks. "Victoria, are you insane? You humiliated me in front of investors. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? Brian, your mother is crying in the car. This is petty. Olivia, even for you." I didn't listen to the voicemails. The transcription previews were enough. Melissa had left one that simply said, "I don't know who you think you are, but you need to fix this now." I scrolled through the messages, my thumb swiping up. Not a single one asked why. Not a single one asked if I could afford $7,500 for a single dinner. Not a single one asked if I was okay. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about the disruption to their supply chain. They were angry because the ATM had eaten their card. It was a barrage, a synchronized assault designed to overwhelm my defenses, to make me retreat into apology and compliance. But as I read the words selfish, dramatic, and ruinous, I didn't feel the familiar crush of shame. I felt something colder. I felt like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. This wasn't love. It wasn't even a family dynamic anymore. It was a transaction that had gone sour. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened my laptop. The blue light illuminated my face in the dark room. I didn't type a response. I didn't call anyone back. Instead, I opened a blank spreadsheet. If they wanted to talk about what I owed the family, fine, we would talk, but we wouldn't use guilt as the currency anymore. We would use math. I cracked my knuckles and started typing. This wasn't an emotional reaction. It was a professional. I titled the file, The Ghost Ledger. I started with the easy things, the black and white numbers, the $5,000 for my father's DUI bail 3 years ago, the $4,000 for Victoria's influencer studio apartment deposit that I never saw again, the $1,200 for Melissa's spiritual wellness retreat to Sedona when she claimed she was burnout from doing nothing. The numbers added up with a lethal precision, a column of black ink that told the story of my own financial stagnation. But as I typed, I realized the money was only half the debt. I created a second column and titled it, The Intangible Cost. This was for the things that didn't have receipts but had cost me everything. The night I missed my own anniversary dinner because Victoria had a crisis about her follower count, cost. One ruined memory. The weekend I spent designing Brian's office expansion for free, only to have him tell me it wasn't quite professional enough. for his friends, cost, my self-esteem. I realized then that my family had perfected the trap of normalized cruelty. They had spent 27 years convinced that my only role was to be the useful one. In their minds, my architectural degree wasn't an achievement to be celebrated. It was a tool for their convenience. They had normalized the idea that my time, my money, and my sanity were community property. They didn't see my sacrifice as love. They saw it as an obligation, and why had I stayed? I was bound by the invisible chain of the survivor. I had been trained to believe that if I just did one more favor, paid one more bill, or swallowed one more insult, the jackpot of validation would finally hit. It was a survival mechanism born from a prison without bars. I stayed because I was a gambler waiting for a win from a rigged machine. I listed every swallowed apology and every ignored boundary. I listed every time I had been the designated driver, the therapist, and the emotional punching bag. By the time I finished, the total was staggering, $95,000. That was a down payment on a house, that was a wedding, that was my entire future liquidated to subsidize their lifestyle. I wasn't just in the red, I was bankrupt. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon the old familiar regret, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. I realized then that I wasn't a daughter to them, I was a venture capitalist with zero equity. Well, I was officially pulling my funding. The account was closed. Everything stayed silent for a few minutes after I closed the laptop, but in my head, their words were still echoing, sharp and jagged. Then the phone rattled against the wood again. 11:51 p.m., a text from Melissa. It was short and final. We've agreed. You're no longer a part of this family. Don't bother coming to the house, consider the ties cut. Seconds later, Victoria hearted the message, the digital equivalent of a nail in the coffin. In my old life, this would have been the moment I broke. I would have been on my knees, typing out a 3-paragraph apology, begging for a chance to explain myself. I would have offered to pay the $7,500 just to see the typing bubble appear on the screen, but that version of Olivia was buried at the yacht club. Anger wasn't loud this time, it was clinical. I didn't cry, I didn't ask why, I just opened my laptop and started clicking. I didn't answer a single one of their texts. Instead, I went back to my spreadsheet. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdraft for years, and now the account was frozen. I realized they weren't shocked by what they'd done, they were shocked that I'd stopped playing along. Melissa and Brian didn't want a daughter, they wanted a silent investor in their version of family. They wanted the stability of my architect's salary without the inconvenience of my presence. To them, I was just a stable supply chain for their illusions. I pulled up the digital guest list for Victoria's gala, the one she had bragged about for weeks. It was a list of minor investors, local Savannah socialites, and lifestyle bloggers. They were the audience for her influencer dreams. If Victoria wanted to play queen, she needed people to believe her throne was solid. I attached the file, the ghost ledger, every mortgage payment I'd covered for Brian, every designer bag I'd lent money for to Victoria, every Sedona wellness retreat I'd subsidized. For Melissa, I wrote a short, professional cover letter. Due to a change in investment strategy, I am withdrawing all financial backing for Victoria's brand launch. Please find the attached audit of the $95,000 already contributed to family operations. This support ends immediately. I hit send at 12:03 a.m. Within minutes, the silence in the apartment was shattered by a new kind of noise, not just my family, but the ripple effect. Brian called, I declined. Melissa called, I declined. Victoria sent a barrage of texts that were no longer smirking, they were frantic. Olivia, delete that email now. You are ruining my career. The investors are asking questions. I didn't answer. I leaned back in my chair and watched the cursor blink. Calm, factual, lethal. I realized then that love in my family had been a subscription, and I was simply footing the bill. Well, the subscription was cancelled. Inside, my laptop glowed with a different kind of sunrise, the kind made of facts, numbers, and quiet retribution. I wasn't reacting anymore, I was auditing, and the villains were about to realize that when you treat your family like a transaction, you shouldn't be surprised when the bank recalls the loan. The digital storm was gathering force, but for the first time in 27 years, I was the one who controlled the weather. The silence following my email was the kind that precedes a landslide. I didn't spend the night wondering if I had gone too far, I spent it digging deeper. I called a former colleague from my firm, a forensic accountant who specializes in tracing misappropriated assets. I needed to know exactly how Brian and Melissa were maintaining a yacht club lifestyle while Brian's development firm was practically a ghost ship. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for 27 years. But I suspected there was a darker ledger they hadn't shown me. We spent the next several hours meticulously reviewing the history of the accounts my grandmother, Eleanor, had established before she passed. Eleanor was the only person who had ever seen me as a person rather than a line of credit. She had left me a trust fund, $100,000 specifically designated for my architectural master's degree or my first home. When I turned 21, my parents told me with practiced gravity that the fund had been wiped out in a bad market investment. I had been a sensible girl back then. I had swallowed my grief, taken out student loans, and worked 3 jobs to pay for the degree they claimed they couldn't afford. My colleague didn't find a market crash, he found a withdrawal, $100,000, removed from the account exactly 3 years ago. I stared at the digital scan of the authorization form on my laptop screen. The signature at the bottom read, Olivia, but the loop of the O was too wide, and the crossing of the T was too aggressive. It was a mirror image of the way my mother signed her holiday cards. Melissa hadn't just neglected me, she had forged my signature to drain my only inheritance while I was eating ramen in a tiny studio apartment. But the discovery went even deeper. My colleague traced the movement of those stolen funds. They hadn't gone towards saving Brian's business or paying Victoria's sorority dues, they had been transferred to a luxury travel concierge. I found the receipt in a buried subfolder of their shared digital drive. A deposit for a world cruise aboard a private yacht, $150,000, fully booked for next autumn. The weight of it hit me with a clinical coldness. This was the lethal discovery. This was why Melissa had leaned over at the yacht club dinner, smelling of Merlot, and whispered that my salary was stable. She wasn't just asking me to pay a $7,500 bill to a support Victoria, she was ensuring that I continued to cover their daily expenses so they wouldn't have to touch their secret cruise fund. They were willing to bankrupt my future, forge my name, and humiliate me in public to protect their 6-month vacation. They hadn't just overdrafted my compassion, they had committed a crime. The trap of normalized cruelty had evolved into a criminal conspiracy. Any remaining thread of familial loyalty I had been clinging to snapped. This was the kill shot. There was no path to redemption for them now. I didn't feel the old familiar urge to fix the mess. I felt like a creditor who was about to call in a very expensive loan. I saved the forged documents, the cruise receipts, and the audit of the stolen $100,000 into a new folder. I titled it, The Execution. Inside, my laptop glowed with a factual, lethal precision. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was the architect of their collapse. The glass doors of my firm didn't stand a chance against the storm. Melissa, Brian, and Victoria arrived with the precision of a wrecking crew, their heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. My staff went silent, but I didn't look up from my monitor. I didn't need to. I could smell the familiar scent of desperate Savannah prestige and overpriced perfume. Melissa was the first to speak, her voice trembling not with sadness, but with the indignity of being exposed. How could you do this, Olivia? You sent that email to Victoria's entire guest list. You have made us a laughingstock at the yacht club. Victoria was right behind her, her mascara smudged into jagged lines of rage. The investors are pulling out. My brand is ruined. You're just a bitter, jealous architect who couldn't stand to see me succeed. I finally looked up. My anger wasn't loud, it was clinical. I didn't scream back. I simply reached into my desk drawer and pulled out the manila folder I had titled The Execution. I placed it on the desk and slid it toward them, the exact same way I had slid the bill at the restaurant. We aren't here to discuss Victoria's follower count, I said, my voice as cold as the morning marshes. We're here to discuss the $100,000 you took from my trust fund 3 years ago. The room went still. Melissa's mouth opened, a denial ready on her tongue, but I was faster. I pulled out the authorization form. I've had a forensic accountant review this. The signature is a forgery. Your handwriting is distinctive, Melissa, even when you are trying to steal from your own daughter. Brian stepped forward, his face a deep, mottled red. Olivia, that was for the family business. Things were tight. Things weren't tight, Brian, I interrupted, cutting through his bluster like a razor. The money didn't go to your firm, it went to a travel concierge. I have the receipts for the world cruise, $150,000, fully booked with my stolen inheritance. The power flip was instant. The arrogance that had sustained them for 27 years evaporated under the blue light of my office. Melissa's shoulders slumped. She didn't look like a queen anymore. She looked like a thief who had finally run out of exits. Please, Melissa whispered, her hand reaching out to grab my sleeve, the same soothing gesture she had used to try and force me to pay for dinner. We can work this out. We will pay you back. Just don't go to the police. Think of Victoria. If this gets out, she'll never recover. I looked at her hand on my arm, then I looked at Victoria, who was suddenly silent, her eyes wide with the realization that the bank was truly closed. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for a lifetime, and now the balance was zero. I already called the police, I said. I handed her a copy of the formal report and the civil suit I had filed that morning. I'm not destroying the honor of this family, I am simply closing out a bad investment. You told me that architect salaries were stable, Melissa. Well, so is a criminal record. I stood up, towering over them as they stood in the center of the office I had built with the sweat and tears they had ignored. The ledger is closed, this family is officially bankrupt. Leave your keys on the table and get out. They didn't argue. They couldn't. They filed out one by one, the sound of their retreating footsteps the only receipt I needed. I sat down, the silence in the office feeling like a debt paid in full. The world cruise never left the harbor. Instead of a private yacht, Melissa and Brian found themselves in a sterile courtroom. The Savannah Yacht Club membership was revoked before the week was out, their names scrubbed from the rolls as quickly as a spilled drink. Savannah has a way of turning its back on a scandal. And the Hendersons were suddenly radioactive. They were forced to sell the family estate to cover the restitution for the $100,000 they had stolen from my trust and the $95,000 documented in my ghost ledger. I realized then that their power had always been an illusion. It was a power illusion of an empty wallet. They had spent decades performing wealth and status, but it was all rented. Their position was a facade built on a foundation of stolen inheritance and unpaid bills. When the money stopped, the people stopped clapping. I learned that character isn't something you can buy at a gala or borrow from a daughter. It is who you are when the chandeliers go dark. Victoria's influencer brand didn't survive the month. When the truth of the fake investors and her parents' criminal charges went viral, her followers vanished in a digital mass exodus. She wasn't a queen on a throne anymore. She was just a warning. She reached out once. A desperate email about how family forgives family, but I didn't even open it. I simply archived it into the folder of a failed business venture. Ryan and I didn't go to Italy. We didn't want to act out a fantasy in a place my mother had chosen to secure with my stolen money. We booked tickets to Tokyo instead. For the first time in my life, my resources are funding my own desires, not someone else's delusions. I am finally in the black. I am currently designing a small house by the sea. A sanctuary where the windows are large, the air is clean, and there is absolutely no room for the invoices of people who treat me like a stranger. The account is closed, the balance is zero, and for the first time in 27 years, I am free. If you support my journey to justice, please like and share this video to spread the message. You never owe anyone the peace of your own soul. Subscribe now to see more stories about reclaiming the life you deserve.